All right, so we are going to talk about the inspector pane on the right-hand side. And basically, I want to focus on some of the tabs in this pane and how this pane works based on what you have selected in the center and on the left-hand side of the screen. So again, this is the inspector panel, the center panel, and then this far left is the navigator. So within the navigator, I'm going to select the main.storyboard, which is basically the area that we create our user interface and do a bunch of different things. And I've added a button to this scene, and if I click on that button, you'll see the inspector panel will change. So we have a couple different tabs at the top, and these different tabs indicate different things that we can inspect or modify about this object. So if I click off of this object, the panel is going to change. So just keep that in mind that it is context sensitive. So I have that button selected, and over here I'm in the attributes inspector. This is the most commonly used inspector. It's this little arrow pointing down. And basically, I think it's supposed to indicate like a slider, essentially. But this is where we would change the font, the color, and certain view modes, things like that, the alignment, etc. So the attributes inspector, probably what you're going to be using about 90% of the time. So to the right of that, we have the size inspector, and this is how we can change how content sits within our object. So I can move that content around by changing these numbers. This is also where you will change the auto resizing options and constraints. You can also change them down here, and again, we'll get into that a little bit more later. The far right is the connections panel. The connections panel is 99% of the time where things break in Xcode. We'll get into how to fix problems with the connections panel later, but basically what this is showing is how this thing that's selected, this button, is connected to our code. And right now it's not, so all of these are blank. But we could, for instance, drag a connection that says, oh, they've touch up inside is the standard, it's been tapped, basically. If the button's been tapped, then do something, and that's where we'll see that here. This is really important because, like I said, whenever things break, in particular, there's an error called a sig abort, or signal abort error, and what that means is that basically something in the connections tab is wrong. Again, I'll show you how to fix that in the future, but just keep that in mind. So we have connections, size, attributes, and now on the left-hand side we have the identity inspector. And the identity inspector is basically where we would assign classes to different things, and it's where we can label things and create different runtime attributes. This is basically, we're not going to be using it too much in this class, but we'll be using it whenever we create new view controllers, which is what we call this whole big white area here. We'll use this to assign custom classes to each view controller. To the left of that, we have the quick help. The quick help is really useful in code. I'm going to go ahead and click on the viewcontroller.swift file. And if I click on a piece of code within that, so for instance, this function called viewDidLoad, it's going to pull up the quick help summary of what exactly that viewDidLoad function does. It's really cool. We can actually search directly in here. We can pull open a browser and see more depth and more detail about whatever we have selected. So it'll change based on what we click around in our document. Again, not really used in storyboard context. I'm going to go back to storyboard, and I'm going to go to the last inspector, which is the file inspector. The file inspector actually really specifically is dealing with files on the left-hand side. We're not really going to use it in this class, so just keep that in mind. So now we've covered all of the interface here on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, and the top. Now we're going to dive into the center of our screen where we're going to be doing all of our code and all of our storyboard work.